Physiological Correlates of Human Behavior, an intro to behavioral neuroscience. With me, Dr. Andrew T. Ainsworth, Professor of Psychology at California State University, Northridge. Part 1, Neural Foundations of Behavior. Lecture 0, Introduction to Brain and Behavior.
Hi, it's Dr. A here. I know we're just starting our journey through brain and behavior, or biopsychology, or psychological neuroscience, or whatever you want to call it. We're going to take this journey together through all the parts of the brain and how it affects our behavior. I want to start our journey today in a nice, tranquil spot here, so we can start off in a nice, relaxed, maybe meditative state. I know this class can be kind of overwhelming for a lot of students. I'm sitting here, it's like I'm on the corner of, this is Nordoff and Selza, more or less, near the orange grove. There's this nice waterfall. It turns into a little stream, and that empties out into a nice pond full of turtles. So if you've never been here, this is a great spot. It's a nice place to come and relax, maybe before midterms or finals when you're feeling a little stressed out. Anyway, today I came to ask one question. Do you have a brain? Like, have you had somebody check? Do you know for sure you have one? I think in a lot of language, we say things like, I have a brain, or that she doesn't have a brain, or he's brainless. I think it's because it's sort of a strange use of language. I think we don't have brains. I think we are brains. I think our brain is who we are. Our personality, our perspective on the world is all from our brain. And we are basically little brain pilots that are running around in these bone and meat suits, right? That's how our brain interact with the world, is through our meat suits. Okay. I still think we are the brain itself. Now, you may agree, disagree, that's fine. I want you to think about that as we talk about the different metaphors that people have had for the brain and for thoughts and for the neural system throughout time. We're going to start with the ancient Greeks all the way through the present day. And we're going to talk about how people thought about the way the brain works. All right. Hope you're excited.
Oh, hey there. I'm just sitting doing some light reading. It's a thesis from one of our illustrious, brilliant alumni. Let's talk about some BOLOs, some be on the lookout. I believe that for learning a new language, which is what we're doing here, right? You're learning the language of neuroscience, and the best way to learn a new language is with just repetition. So my plan is to make these be on the lookout videos and to give you a list of all the terms to go with each lecture so that you can hear the terms being said. You can be on the lookout for them as you're going through the lectures, and you can actually start to write out the definitions of all of them as a way of sort of studying and learning and creating your own study guide for each exam. So what exactly is a BOLO? It's simple. There's a list of terms that I want you to be on the lookout for. And I'm going to read them out loud so you can hear what they sound like. Hopefully I pronounce them correctly. There's a chance for some of these I may not. There's some complicated terms, but I'm gonna give it my best shot so you can hear it. You'll get it, through your ear balls, right, into your brain. And you'll see the words on the screen. You also have the list, so you'll get it in multiple ways. And then as you go through the lecture, you'll be able to hear them again and see them in context, hear them in context. So my goal is to help you try to learn all this stuff. All right, so how's this going to work? I'm going to read some terms, And we're going to go through this sort of late night show sort of style, like Jimmy Kimmel, right? Just going to read these off. So this is for Lecture 0. Here are the terms. Hydraulics, water clocks, Hippocrates, humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, Galen, temperaments, choleric, melancholic, sanguine, phlegmatic, Rene Descartes, animal spirits, Luigi Galvani, Alessandro Volta, galvanometer, galvanism, Mary Shelley, Johannes Müller, Hermann von Helmholtz, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, electronic numerical integrator and computer, Alan Turing, the Turing test, neural networks, Walter Pitts Jr., and Warren McCulloch. So listen back to those terms. It's also good. You can put them back. You can put them on to 2.5 speed and listen to them real quick, and just as a way of refreshing memory before exams. But go through those terms, and even as you're listening to those terms, try to think about how these terms might go together. Like, why was Mary Shelley in there? Why would her work have anything to do with the rest of these? How are these people connected? How are these terms connected? The more you think about this, the more you try to weave this stuff together, the better you're going to learn. All right, let's head off to lecture. So let's start with an intro to brain and behavior. This intro is a little different than the intro that is covered in the book. These are my own thoughts about introducing you to the topic. And we're going to go through a little bit of history and some background on how far we've come along in thinking about the brain and the nervous system. So the human brain, it's 3 pounds, give or take, of a wet, spongy, sort of wrinkly, fairly disgusting looking thing when it comes right down to it, right? So we're going to ask all kinds of questions about the brain and how it relates to behavior. Like, what does the brain do? What are its parts? What do those parts do? How are they organized? How is information shared from the brain to the body? Like, how does a signal go from my brain to make my finger move? But then also, as I touch things, I'm touching this light board here, how does the signal get sent from my finger back to my brain? How do we know this? How have we figured out how exactly the signals are sent? What kinds of experiments have we done? What kinds of things have we done over time to figure all this stuff out? We seem to know an awful lot about how the brain works. So how do we know that? And then, of course, we're going to tie all this back to how does it all impact behavior, both positively and negatively. Positively in terms of, controlling our movements and be able to do things like play the piano, or to be able to feel, the feelings of like feathers or something soft to their fingers and know that's what we're feeling, to negative things, to looking at the negative impacts that the disorders in the brain have on creating disorders in our bodies or disorders in our behaviors. So we're going to talk about all this stuff in some form or another as we go through this topic. Now, this first part is all about, you see that in part 1 here, part 1 is all neuro foundations of behavior. So we're going to go through a few different topics about those foundations, and here we're just introducing all of it. For each lecture, we're going to go through a couple different things. One, I'm going to do an introduction to the topic and get you thinking about the different aspects of the topic we're going to be discussing. I'm going to try to do those outside of the light board, try to highlight some areas around campus, and record sort of out in the wild and do some introductions that way. I'm also going to record something I'm calling Be on the Lookout, which is, there's a lot of terms. This class has lots and lots of terminology. Like, the more you're exposed to those terms, the more likely you are to remember those terms. So I'm going to go through and just read off terms sort of rapid fire style as part of just sort of introducing you to the sounds and the complicated terms that we're going to be going through. And so you can hear them once. We'll go through them again in the lecture with definitions, and then I'll also give you an accompanying sheets so you can go through those terms and actually start to keep track of what all the different things mean. I'm also going to go through the lecture slides here and do a discussion here in the Lightboard studio, try to make it as entertaining as possible, try to shift around and do different camera angles so that you can stay interested in what we're talking about, and just make sure everything is as entertaining while being informational at the same time. We're also going to go through a couple things like detour stories when there's time, and when it's applicable. I'll tell you some stories that'll be a bit of a detour just to give you some background information and some color commentary on the stuff we're talking about. But then also go through persons of interest, and a person could be a person of interest for many different things. We're going to highlight different people. Sometimes it's because they're an important part of the building blocks of neuropsychology or brain and behavior. Sometimes because they're not. Sometimes I want to highlight people that have played an important role or have some important role that the sort of within them that has been ignored or not been displayed. I want to try to, we're going to talk a lot about Germans in terms of founding fathers and things. We'll talk about Italians and French. I like to highlight some other folks from different countries, folks from different backgrounds that have contributed to the work of neuropsychology. And I want to highlight when those things are important. Sometimes just to give you a different perspective and to point out that there have been just a variety of people from all walks of life that have contributed in some way or another to the different aspects of brain and behavior, neuropsychology, and neuroscience. The class will be organized basically into 4 parts. We're right now in the first part. We're doing an introduction to the sort of foundations of what is sort of behavioral neuroscience, but the foundations of neuroscience. We go through these first 4 chapters. Then we'll move into the second part, which is about motivation and how we're motivated to different things, like how sex traits and gender traits are sort of come out from our biology, our emotions and health. Things like motivating regulation and internal states like hunger and sleep, even sex, things like that. And we'll also talk a little bit about how we've learned a lot about how the brain works from things like addiction and the addiction reward sort of process within the brain. We'll talk a lot about those things in part 2. For part 3, we're going to be talking about interacting with the world. So we're going to go through hearing and language, vision and visual perception, and the body senses and movement, things like the kinesthetic sense, hearing, taste, touch, those kinds of things we're going to talk about in chapter 11. And the last part of the course, we'll talk about complex behaviors, and we'll tie it all back to things like learning and memory, intelligence and cognitive function. And then we'll talk, of course, about psychological disorders that relate to brain and behavior. And then we'll also talk about sleeping and dreaming. And that'll be the last part, and then that'll be the end of the session. So there's 4 parts. We've got a lot to cover. Hopefully we'll get through it and keep it entertaining, keep it interesting. So one of the things that I like to think about when it comes to thinking about the brain is that over time, throughout history, we've had lots and lots of different analogies and metaphors for how the brain works or what we think the brain is doing. You go back even as far as ancient Greece, all the way up to the 1600s, people really looked to hydraulics. They looked at water systems, ways of pushing water through pipes to create pressure, and you can then move things and create changes in pressure and things like that. So these are things like, this is a water clock here, different versions of water clocks. But even back when they had just aqueducts and different systems, they were able to use those to create movement and to control different apparatus. So they thought, oh, okay, well, since I'm able to move my arm in a similar way that water moves an apparatus, the brain must work in some way like a hydraulic system. And that stayed, pretty, that was like the height of, modern science at that point. So that's sort of where people went to. So that influenced a lot of things. I mean, we go back to some of the ideas that have stuck around for a while, and even though we may not directly use these as science or medical practices anymore, there's still a lot of influence on things. So Hippocrates, back somewhere 460 BC, 370 BC in Greece. He talked about the humors in the human body, which again are fluids. He talked about there are 4 different fluids, humors in the body. And it's also where the term like the Hippocratic Oath, where medical doctors take the oath to protect their patients. That's the Hippocrates is where that came from. The Hippocratic Oath and Hippocrates are that's the same name, same word. A student of Hippocrates was Claudius Galenus. That's how sometimes it's referred to as Galen. He was 129 AD through 216 AD. He took the idea of humors and how humors impact the body, and he started talking about temperaments, how those humors can affect people's personalities and their temperaments and how they behave. And he put together a whole theory about temperaments. And this work that he did, amongst other things, influenced Western medicine for like 1,300 years after he came up with all these ideas about the temperaments and temperaments based on the balance of humors in the body. So the 4 humors that Hippocrates talked about were blood, obviously. You had yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And there he talked about these 4 different temperaments, which were sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. You can start to see where this is going, where if someone has too much blood in their body, they were seen as being a bit too sanguine, or that was their temperament because they had too much blood. Or having too much yellow bile made you choleric. Having too much black bile made you melancholic, and too much phlegm made you more phlegmatic. Let's think about what that means. Temperament, like we don't oftentimes use those terms anymore in terms of temperament. Think about personality types and things, but as temperaments go, here's an early view of the 4 humors. Again, so you have yellow bile, black bile, blood, phlegm. You can see here that they started to associate these different levels of fluids with different personality types, and even things like times of the year and where they were found most. So if you were phlegmatic, it was seen to be influencing the brain. It was influenced by the moon. It was more of an autumn kind of temperament. It's related to water and things like maturity, and we're more sort of cold and moist. So they had all these associations with these temperaments and having an imbalance of humors. It's kind of hard to think about what that might look like, but here this is too much blood is being seen as being more like adolescent. You're more sort of hot and moist. That's related more to air and the heart. Here in black bile, seen being more associated with the spleen and winter and more old age. It was more an earth temperament. It was more cold and dry. Up here with yellow bile is more seen as something that was in childhood, more of a childhood temperament, related more with summer and Mars and the gallbladder. But let's think about what does that mean in terms of personality, right? Because these are temperaments. These are ways that people behaved and ways their temperaments sort of came to the surface. So let's talk about what that looks like. So this is more looking at the different kinds of personality traits, or someone who's sanguine, who's again got too much blood in their system, seen as more leadership qualities, more carefree, lively, easygoing, more responsive, more talkative, more outgoing, sociable. So people on this side, the sanguine and choleric, were seen as more extroverted. Someone who's choleric has too much yellow bile is seen as sort of choleric. They're seen as active, optimistic, impulsive, changeable, excitable, aggressive, restless, touchy. If you're on this side, you're more introverted. If you're on the top, you're more of a stable personality. If you're on the bottom, you're more unstable. So if you had too much black bile, right, you're seen as more sort of melancholic, right? Make sure that's thing is true. Or black bile is more melancholic, right? So here's someone who's quiet. They're not very sociable. They're reserved, pessimistic, sober, rigid, anxious, moody. And then up here, of course, phlegmatic, you're someone who's more calm, even-tempered, reliable, controlled, peaceful, thoughtful, careful, passive. So at that point, people, when it came to looking at these different types of fluids, humors in the body, and if you were someone who was, say, you had too much of the choleric personality, right? they would try to reduce the amount of yellow bile in your system. If you were too much melancholy or too melancholic, they would try to reduce the amounts of black bile in your system. Now, one of the easiest ones to think about is this idea of sanguine. If you had too much blood in your system, right, you would do what? You'd bleed people. You would use things like leeches. You would, at this point, you would go to a barber, because back then it was like barber/surgeon. They would do things like, use leeches to suck out your blood. They would cut you so you would bleed out, to reduce the amount of blood, to reduce the impact that having too much blood had on your system. This is where they're trying to keep all these humors in balance to keep your temperament sort of even and normal over time. They saw buildups of these humors as affecting temperament. Now we know that things like leeches and bloodletting and things aren't very good. We don't go to barbers for that anymore. Matter of fact, the red stripe around the barber pole was supposed to represent the fact that they did do bloodletting, and it's just sort of stayed that way over time. It's interesting that this belief system about the temperaments related to the humors, it stayed that way for a long time. Like you watch a lot of movies, look at a lot of history about people who continued to do things to relieve different kinds of ailments and to treat people's temperaments by doing things like bleeding them, or trying to reduce their phlegm, or reduce their black bile. All these different, so it sounds today like almost like witch doctory or like voodoo or something. It's like that, it almost seems silly. Back then, that was like the height of science. That is what they thought was the most scientific way to treat all these elements. All right, well, here's a name that you've hopefully heard of it somewhere, some form or another, in some place or another. René Descartes. He's a French philosopher and scientist. He's the one that when you hear the term "I think, therefore I am," that's a famous quote from René Descartes. He thought the nervous system transported animal spirits in the form of fluids to and from the brain, and depending on what kind of spirit was being sent out or brought back, would change the kind of behavior or kinds of emotions or feelings that were being felt by the brain from the body. Many phenomena we take to be mental states, mental phenomena. He thought they were physical. There were physical states that could be explained by these different types of animal spirits, and were regulated by the flow of fluids through the nerves or through the nervous system. So instead of thinking about it being an electrical impulse, they thought, he was thinking that it was literally animal spirits flowing from our brain through our nerves to our body. The nice thing is this sort of bridged the gap between thinking about this sort of hydraulic form of control of the body to a more sort of machine or mechanical form metaphor for the brain. That's a pretty long quote, but let's check out what René Descartes said. The reception of light, sounds, odors, tastes, warmth, and other like qualities into the exterior organs of sensation, the impression of the corresponding ideas upon a common sensorium and on the imagination, the retention or imprint of these ideas in the memory, the internal movements of the appetites and passions, and finally the external motions of all the members of the body, I wish that you would consider all these as following altogether naturally in this machine from the disposition of its organs alone, neither more or less than do the movements of a clock or other automaton from that of its counterweights and wheels. So a lot to say here, but he started to change the way that people believed about this sort of hydraulic system being impacted by things like humors, to really thinking about us more akin to machines, mechanical things like counterweights and wheels and cogs and springs. So there was a time where people started to think about our brains as being like a machine, and started to view our behaviors in a much more mechanical fashion. This picture here is Jacques de Vaucanson. He made a mechanical duck that you could put food or things into its mouth, it would go through the process of digestion, and then it would like poop it out. And this was, people thought this was like this awesome display of mechanical wizardry at the time. And people started to view things like cells in the body like factories that were delivering energy to our body. So they all perform different tasks as workers in a factory. So we started to see things more in line with the ability for folks to have these rudimentary machines back at this time. So I point out this because this was the sort of the height. So when I'm saying machine, don't think sort of modern machine. These were more rudimentary machines, but it really started to impact the way that people saw the human body. And as things became more automated and they had more machines sort of doing things, people started to think like, oh, that's sort of like how the heart and the brain and all these other things are working together as a machine to make the human being work and to do what we need to do and to be able to feed ourselves and all that kind of stuff. So here's another quote here. The human body is a machine that winds its own springs, the living image of perpetual motion. Man is an assemblage of springs that are activated reciprocally by one another. So again, this is sort of at around this time, we started to see the sort of like clocks and machinery sort of analog or metaphor for the human behavior, human brain and nervous system. Also around that time, you started to see the rise of this electric or electricity metaphor, along with telegraph and telephone metaphors for how the brain communicates with the body and how messages are carried to and from parts of your body from the brain and to the brain. So what we started seeing is people doing experiments to show that animals also ran on electricity. And so you have Luigi Galvani, along with his partner Alessandro Volta, who started doing pioneering research on electricity in about the 1790s. They were hooking up electrodes. They were taking like frogs' legs and hooking the electrodes to the frogs' legs to demonstrate that if they actually turned on the voltage, the frogs' legs would start to move and contract, to show that they were being at least somewhat run by electricity. Now, as soon as first time I ever saw that picture, almost immediately, association came to my mind. Now, this may date me a little bit, may make me seem a little old, but I'm hoping that you've seen this before. Maybe. Let's see. If not, at least even if it's the first time, it should be kind of fun. So the first time I remember seeing this, my first thought was from this cartoon. This is a Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes cartoon. And this is the first thing I thought as soon as I saw that picture.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss by wire. Baby, my heart's on fire. If you refuse me, honey, you lose me. Then you'll be left alone. Oh, baby, telephone and tell me I'm your own.
Now, if you haven't seen that video before with the dancing frog, you've probably seen other things that have referenced it or imitated it. It's been a number of modern cartoons, and it's been part of our sort of collective conscience for probably close to a century. So you've probably seen something like it before. So if it sounds familiar, it looks sort of familiar, that's because it probably is. For a long time, the television station, like the Warner Brothers, the WB station, they had that frog as part of their ads for a while. So it's been around for a while. So hopefully you've seen it, and I'm only mentioning it here as a way of giving you this association with this idea of these sort of dancing frogs' legs via electricity and Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta's work back in the 1700s. Moving on with this idea of electricity and telegraph and telephone. With Galvani's work actually inspired a number of people to try to look at how nerves and nerve endings were conducting electricity. So there was an invention called a galvanometer in about 1820 that was used to measure electric currents in animals and frogs and humans. And there's a bit of a, I don't know, debate, I guess, about who gets credit for it. There's this Hans Christian Oersted, there's Johann Schweiger, there's André Marie Ampere, there's Claude Paulet. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those names correctly, but hopefully I'm close. They're all credited in some way or another of inventing some type or some building block to what eventually became this machine like this, where an electrode or something could be put into a nerve and it could actually measure the amount of voltage that was being collected. This breakthrough with the galvanometer is actually so important that because it was able to detect very minor amounts of electrical impulse, that it actually became important to developing things like the transatlantic telegraph. So to be able to take the telegraph, underneath the Atlantic Ocean, be able to communicate across the ocean, the signal became so weak because it was surrounded by water and it was buried so deep in the ocean that they use a galvanometer to be able to detect the smallest amounts of electricity and be able to send things like telegraph signals and Morse code. As all this was going on, this idea of sort of a galvanometer, be able to measure electricity, using electricity to experiment on animals and show that the impulses could actually create the impulses could actually create movement in the animals. There started to become this idea that, like, okay, well, if electricity could help animals move, we can take frog legs and make them dance because of the electricity. These are just legs; they're not even attached to a body, right? So it's sort of creepy, but it's like just legs being electrified. If they can do that, well, I wonder, if they can do more. If we can do more with electricity. So there was this movement, this belief called galvanism. It's the generation of electrical current by chemical action in the body or in the nerves. But it also that the contraction and convulsion of biological muscle tissue upon contact with electrical current. So people started to really get into it and do lots and lots of experiments around this to figure out how exactly electricity could be an impetus to movements and maybe bring dead things back to life. All right? Does that sound familiar? Using electricity to bring dead things back to life. What does that sound like? Maybe a little like Frankenstein? The timing of this is pretty interesting because around the same time that galvanism was taken off, people started believing this idea that electricity could jumpstart dead tissue. Mary Shelley wrote a book about a corpse being brought back using electricity. Right? Dr. Frankenstein bringing Frankenstein's monster back. I know I said Frankenstein here, but let's make sure that I don't confuse everybody, because there's always this common misconception. This is not Frankenstein. This is Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein's actually Victor Frankenstein, who's the doctor, the scientist. Anyway, Victor Frankenstein bringing back his monster back to life. In this case, it's actually a body that's made up of a bunch of different parts from different people, all sort of sewn together, to the point where it became a very famous movie.
alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
I found that pretty fascinating. Around the same time, right, there are people using real life events and real life beliefs, and how our beliefs and how the human body worked impacted the things that we believed. She wrote a fictional story about a doctor bringing a corpse back to life, while all these experiments with dead tissue and how electricity can impact that dead tissue were all happening. It's interesting because here's my little detour for a second. It's also a person of interest and detour combined. This was so prolific, this idea about electricity bringing back dead tissue, or maybe bringing back people from the dead, that it impacted numerous, not like books, but also movies. Here's Boris Karloff. This is actually Robert De Niro in a version, this was in the 90s, I believe, of, it's called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Here's, Herman Munster from the Munsters TV show, and there was a recent movie, or remake of that by Rob Zombie. This is Peter Boyle in Young Frankenstein, the Mel Brooks movie. And there's even, this is Frankie from, Hotel Transylvania. And again, this, all these different Frankenstein's monsters, all the way around to the point where, of course, you have all these sort of, ugly and hideous and sort of funny. And this is another funny one. He's also sort of funny. But you got to come full circle and have a sexy one, too. So this is from a movie called I, Frankenstein, or something like that. I, Frankenstein, I Monster, or something like that. I forgot. This is Aaron Eckhart playing the super buff, sexy Frankenstein. How you've an idea has really made it into the sort of Hollywood. This is right. You got to come back around all the way to have a super sexy version of it, because why not? Right? So all of these characters, and there's even more. There was recently the movie Lisa Frankenstein was just released. Pretty close. I think within a year of making this video. This is something that's stuck around for a long time, all based on this idea that electricity can impact tissue. So the author, Mary Shelley, there's the person of interest part. She was obviously influenced by this idea of galvanism. She was the author of Frankenstein. So she lived 1797, 1851. But the interesting thing is that she wrote Frankenstein in 1818 at just 20 years old. So Frankenstein was also in some places called the modern Prometheus, based on the sort of Greek story of Prometheus who brought a person to life. She was also, and this is where interesting facts about people, because I found this fascinating, that Mary Shelley is considered one of the pioneers, right? Breakthrough in terms of science fiction, in terms of horror. Like the whole horror genre probably wouldn't exist, or at least not in the same way, if it wasn't for books like Frankenstein or Dracula, right, impacting this thing. So Frankenstein was written by a 20-year-old woman who, through her journals and things, were also I think professed to be bisexual and was from would nowadays be considered part of the LGBTQ community, and yet impacted this whole genre of people that sort of transcends all kinds of things, transcends language, transcends identity, transcends all kinds of stuff. So I find it fascinating that when I read about that, I had no idea, and not that I really thought about the sexuality of the woman who wrote Frankenstein, but when I read about that, I thought that's actually really interesting. Maybe some students might like to know that. More importantly, around the time that, around this time, in 1803, a man named Giovanni Aldini, who is the nephew of Luigi Galvani, experimented on a hanged murderer, George Forster, with electricity. So we moved from frogs' legs to maybe some illegal corpse stealing and experimental stuff done on corpses, which sounds a lot more like Frankenstein. So the first application of the process to the face, the jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver. The adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. So this is a picture of the experiments they're doing. Look, I mean, they had, they were putting electricity through severed heads. They had, bodies without heads, and they were literally doing some gruesome Frankenstein-esque experiments on a hanged criminal, and probably done so. It's hard to know, because at that time, most criminal bodies might have been just straight up donated to universities. So whether or not they actually stole the body and did these experiments, or did them with the permission, it's kind of hard to say, but it all seems kind of funky, no matter what. It seems kind of morally a little gross either way. So here we have Mary Shelley writing a book based on current events that were all influenced by people's beliefs at the time, this idea of galvanism and electricity being able to reanimate dead tissue, which I find super fascinating. Man, I've never known that before, but here we go. That's where Frankenstein came from. So what else? Moving along from Frankenstein and Mary Shelley and galvanism, moving forward a little bit, you have two men. There's a sort of teacher and a student. Again, these are German. That were looking at nerves and nerve energies. We moved along a little bit later in the century when this stuff was going on, but they were looking at things like Mueller's contribution was this idea of the law of specific nerve energies, that nerves were carried specific functions. Every nerve had its own, it carried out its own function, whether to or from the brain. Where Hermann von Helmholtz he took that a bit further and realized that the same nerves can do different things depending on the speed of transmission and depending on different combinations of things. And he started to look at how much, by being able to measure the amount of electricity carried by each nerve. And so he was able to be one of the first ones to actually measure the speed of electrical transmission throughout the body. He was also credited as the first person to use the telegraph metaphor to explain the brain and the nervous system. So in terms of using a telephone exchange or a telegraph exchange, so this metaphor, they started to use the metaphor of the telegraph, which had, again, wires connecting cities, wire connecting continents to one another, be able to carry information very fast over long distances, started to become a more common metaphor. So here's a quote from a man named Alfred Smee, who said, "In animal bodies, we really have electro-telegraphic communication in the nervous system. That which is seen or felt or heard is telegraphed to the brain." So the terminology, like, they started to think about this transmission like a telegraph, and started to become the more common metaphor for brain and nervous system activity. Continuing this idea of the sort of telegraph, Santiago Ramon Cajal, who was a Spanish artist turned scientist, used the telegraph network as an analogy to understand the structure and function of even a single neuron. He's credited as one of the first to create detailed drawings of neurons that are still used today. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1906, together with the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi. Maybe it's Camillo Golgi? I don't know. In recognition of their work on the structure of the nervous system. I mention this because, again, Santiago Ramon Cajal, it's not like he's like an unfamiliar name, but not as many people know about him as, say, some of these other people we're talking about. So I wanted to take another second to do a bit of a focus on him, and to do a little person of interest story about him. Now, one of the things I want to say here that is interesting about this is that I specifically chose this particular video. It's in Spanish. So he's a Spanish researcher and artist, and all the videos I looked for to try to find a quick snippet about him just didn't seem to do it justice. So I left it in the original Spanish. There are Spanish subtitles, but I left it in its original Spanish on purpose to really capture the sort of real, I don't know, it just seemed much more authentic that way. So here it is in Spanish, the story of Santiago, Ramon y Cajal.
Santiago, Ramón y Cajal, 1852-1934. Santiago Ramón y Cajal nace en Petilla de Aragón en 1852, donde su padre, Justo Ramón, era médico rural. En su juventud tuvo muchas aficiones artísticas y literarias. Le encantaba el dibujo, la fotografía. Estudia medicina en Zaragoza. Allí trabaja con su padre, que era profesor de anatomía. Acabada la carrera y ante la situación política que vivía el país, ejerció de médico militar en la Tercera Guerra Carlista y posteriormente en Cuba. En 1880 se casa con Silveria Fañanás y tuvo 6 hijos. Con la intención de preparar oposiciones a cátedra se traslada a la Universidad Central de Madrid, donde realiza su tesis doctoral titulada Patogenia de la inflamación, dirigida por Aureliano Maestre de San Juan. En 1881 publica un libro dedicado a las terminaciones nerviosas de los músculos, donde se aprecia ya su interés por el sistema nervioso. En 1883 obtiene la cátedra de Anatomía de la Universidad de Valencia. Aquí conoce a Luis Simarro, quien le da a conocer la importancia del Tratado de Golgi y el método de tinción de células para el estudio del sistema nervioso. En 1887 se traslada a Barcelona y en 1892 a Madrid, donde continúa su investigación. La técnica cromoargéntica de Golgi permitía la tinción de las células del sistema nervioso de modo selectivo y preciso. Utilizando dicha técnica, Cajal descubre que el sistema nervioso está formado por células independientes, llamadas neuronas. Es lo que se denominó teoría neuronal. Además, fue capaz de describir cómo se transmitía el impulso nervioso de una célula a otra, proceso que se conoce como polarización dinámica de las neuronas. Este descubrimiento contravenía claramente la teoría hasta entonces reconocida, la teoría reticularista. Según esta, se creía que las neuronas se unían unas con otras formando una fina red en la sustancia gris. Cajal acude al Congreso de la Sociedad Anatómica Alemana, en Berlín, 1890, a exponer la teoría neuronal. A partir de este momento, figuras de la talla de Kölliker, Lenhosek, Retzius, Van Gehuchten las aceptaron y difundieron. En 1906 recibe el premio Nobel junto a Camillo Golgi por sus estudios sobre la estructura del sistema nervioso. Santiago Ramón y Cajal es hoy uno de los investigadores más grandes de todos los tiempos.
So moving forward in time, now in like the late 1800s, even throughout today, we started to view the brain as a complex machine that processes information like a digital computer. So as computers started to become on the scene, and computers that were first on the scene were not like you might think today. I don't know if you may or may not know this, but I can remember going to a friend of ours growing up, had a family. This family had, the dad worked for like a think tank, something like government or something. They were the only ones I remember having a computer. And their computer at this point was the size, it took up an entire room. And it was this massive set of machinery that did all this computing. It probably had the memory, like your cell phone now probably has way more memory, does way more than that thing ever could do. But that was how computers worked. They were these massive room-sized monstrosities. You've probably seen like old movies where they have like the tape, reel-to-reel tapes going, and that's sort of what computers look like. Those were computers of the time, and those were considered this ultra-modern, those were like breakthrough things of the day. Driven a lot by World War II and the need to be able to compute very complex things very quickly to figure out things like missile trajectories and stuff like that. So we have the war, I guess, to thank in some degree of where we are in terms of computer technology. Anyway, we had these computers. We started to view our brain like a computer. So one of the first, there were computers that were being built like academically. People were putting stuff together, but the first one to really be sort of funded like by the government, one of the big ones, was this electronic numerical integrator and computer. The ENIAC was the world's first general purpose electronic digital computer. It was commissioned in 1946 to calculate artillery firing tables for the U.S. Army during World War II. There's often a theme in a lot of these like sort of histories of things where terrible things like war have brought upon a lot of modernization and a lot of breakthroughs in technology. So sometimes it takes terrible events like this to actually push us to reinvent things and to find better ways of doing things, which is unfortunate, but it's a pretty common theme throughout a lot of histories of most anything. That includes psychology and neuropsychology. In thinking of computers, there was Alan Turing, who he lived, 1912 to 1954 in England. Considered the founder of computer science. He was a revered code breaker. He broke these really complex Enigma codes in World War II. There's a pretty recent movie about him called The Imitation Game, which is what he originally called this test that he had put together. So the Turing test is a term that's still sort of used today, that you hear quite a lot. This idea of questions to ask a computer so that you can actually tell whether or not it's a computer or not. It's like to be able to tell if you're talking to a human or not. And there's some people recently with like ChatGPT and stuff, or something like that, the AI that's out right now, that have claimed to have beat the Turing test, but up until that point, most computers fail it. Anyway, it was a system of questions to see if computers can emit intelligent behavior equivalent to that of a human and be able to tell if from a human or not. It's interesting, about 1951, he was sort of busted for homosexuality. It sounds kind of weird nowadays, but the story of some of this, I'm probably going to mess this up, but he started to see a man, because he was engaged shortly to a woman, but he also had relationships with men too, and he was dating a man who I think had somebody or knew somebody that like broke into his house and stole a bunch of stuff. So when he went to report the break-in, he had to admit to this relationship with the person that was friends with them. And they found that out. He actually got an indecency conviction. This is in England around this time. He was convicted of indecency, and he was offered the choice, some choices, and one of them, well, he can either stay in prison, or he can go through a process called chemical castration, where he took large quantities of, I think, estrogen or some female hormone to sort of help sever, to reduce his sexual instincts and that kind of stuff. And it sort of changed him, I think, his personality and kind of stuff. And because of being homosexual, he also lost his security clearance. Even though he was one of the greatest code breakers to ever live, and he's a founder of computer science and did all this breakthrough stuff with computers, the fact that his sexuality is what actually they took away his security clearance. And even though he stayed in academia, he no longer worked for the government anymore. He didn't have the clearance. And then it's also this another sort of mysterious thing where he died, in 1954. He was not very old, obviously. Died in 1954, and it was claimed to be a suicide, but it was like he had eaten an apple that had cyanide in it. So there's all this mystery around how it is he died, and that's a whole other question about whether or not he committed suicide or was murdered by somebody. So it's a very interesting, very, very interesting story of this code breaker from World War II, especially when you get into his personal life and stuff and how complicated things were at the time, for simply being gay at a time when it wasn't okay to be gay. Anyway, if you haven't seen it, go see The Imitation Game. That actually is about Alan Turing. You can see a bit more about his life. As this idea of computers continue to grow, right? computers got more complicated, we now not only just have computers, we have computers linked to other computers, creating networks of computers. So this idea of neural networks, about the mid-1900s to now, we started to look at computers as neural networks. That not only do we have this brain that has all these circuits, but each of those circuits are doing different things, communicating with other parts of our brain, creating a whole network of interconnected neurons. So this is Walter Pitts Jr., and this is Warren McCulloch. They were the first to put together a mathematical model of neural networks where they try to map out how the brain might work as a neural network. And they're considered at least one of the fathers of artificial intelligence because of their work on neural networks. What about today? So are we still just looking at computers? Are we still neural networks? All we got? I think there's another cultural thing that happened a few years ago that also changed the way we think about how the brain works, and that is Inside Out, 2015. Inside Out, we had all these different emotions, different parts of the brain, different parts of things. It's actually, strangely, if you think about it, this almost goes back and mirrors back to the idea of humors back in, with the ancient Greeks and Hippocrates and Galen talking about temperaments and things. Because if, whenever the anger gets a little bit too out of control, the kid would become more angry and see more of that stuff. So it's like, as long as all these things were in balance, and it was basically the main emotion kept sort of everything in check, so the kid didn't get too sad or too mad or too scared or whatever. As long as that stayed, as long as that worked, everything kept in check, in balance, then the kid stayed pretty healthy. And that's sort of what sort of full circle back this idea of humors and keeping yourself in balance and sort of a healthy balance of all these different parts of our being, right? That's what Inside Out really gets at. I think it's actually a really good, a really effective way of especially teaching kids about different aspects of our personality and how you can't let one thing become more than another. Anyway, but I think this is a lot of times people nowadays think about different emotions, different things as these characters because of Inside Out. And I would think that we're probably going to start to move towards thinking about the brain and how the brain works and the functions as some form of like these AI and LLM, these large language models we have, like ChatGPT, that they're these large scale processors taking in a bunch of information and are able to form new ideas and this idea that our brains really are talking about intelligence, real intelligence, that these things are modeling what our intelligence is supposed to be like. So I think in some ways we're going to start to think about how the brain works and how stuff works. The more we understand things like large language models and how they work, the more we start to use those as a metaphor for how the brain works and how the nervous system works. But we'll see. I could be wrong. Maybe we'll just continue thinking about things as Inside Out. But this, I think, sometimes is a more effective way of thinking about it than all this other crazy stuff we talked about so far. We'll see. I don't know. AI is taking over. There's so much AI everywhere. It's such a big deal right now. Given the date of this, you could be viewing this sort of years later. When I recorded this, it wasn't that long ago that the CSU system actually did an arrangement with ChatGPT called ChatGPT EDU, and there are parts of the CSU system that love it or are enthralled that we now have access to this information. There are other parts of it that are trying to fight it and trying to get it closed down. So AI is a super divisive, controversial thing right now. And until we start to get some things that, safeguards in place, I think this is gonna be Wild West for a while. Anyway, hopefully this gives you an idea of the different ways in which the brain has been viewed over time and how whatever the beliefs were at the time in terms of the thing that was seen as the most scientific or breakthrough or most modern way of thinking about things at the time were oftentimes then used as metaphors for the brain and how the brain functioned, how the brain was able to communicate with all the other parts of the body. So that pretty much ends this particular lecture, and we'll come back and talk about the book's introduction in the next section.